In the wake of pressure from the US and changing opinions of the Canadian people, the Canadian government has just introduced new laws that will give them huge new powers to control who comes into the country, who can stay, and who can become a citizen. And this impacts every single Canadian as it reveals an uncomfortable problem that nobody is talking about out in public, and how politicians from all parties are at worst lying and at best being intentionally misleading when it comes to this critical issue that impacts not just Canadians today, but the lives of our children and our grandchildren for generations to come. So here are the new bills that are high on the government's priority list, given that they can only make changes for a couple more weeks before their almost 3-month summer break. The first bill, Bill C2, known as the Strong Borders Act, makes changes to not just tighten up the immigration system, but also to address a number of other border-related issues, while controversially giving the government and police forces far more power. Simultaneously, another new proposed law expands who's eligible for automatic Canadian citizenship, specifically for people who are born outside of the country to parents that have Canadian citizenship, even if those parents have spent limited time in Canada. Now, at first, this might not seem like it applies to you directly, but give me a second here because I promise it does. Let me explain. It's true that these new laws have the potential to address illegal immigration and border security, but I think that this is really burying the lead. It's shifting the conversation away from major issues like how Canadians are changing their opinions as a result of government and corporate exploitation of migrants, and how this all impacts the economy and our jobs and the ticking time bomb that these policies are really meant to solve. You see, about a year ago, back in 2024, the Trudeau government admitted that they let their immigration policies get out of hand. Amidst a housing and healthcare crisis, rising unemployment rates, and reports of Canada's youth struggling to find their first jobs to get the needed experience in the workforce. Well, because of all this, the government changed their public opinion on this issue, but I have reason to believe that behind the scenes, nothing's really changed here. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Even farther back in 2022, changes were made that started this whole situation, or at least made it worse. Changes that were made to the Temporary Worker and International Student Program back in 2022. It was ideally designed to help address a labor shortage, something that big businesses were lobbying for. Now, it also coincidentally helped these same corporations keep the wages that they pay their employees low by increasing the supply of workers available to them. At the same time, this also helped the Bank of Canada, Canada's central bank, in their efforts to recover from the highest inflation we've seen in decades, both in terms of asset prices and goods and services. This inflation, admittedly, was part of a side effect of their pandemic response. Inflation, in the Bank of Canada's mind, was kept down by adding these additional workers because businesses didn't need to raise prices to pay their workers higher wages. Additionally, it also helped the government claim that our economy was showing growth, even though this growth was the product of not innovation, not productivity, but of adding more workers to the system, while simultaneously increasing demand for goods and services through an expansion of the population. It's going to drive more purchasing, it's going to drive more spending. But wage growth wasn't the only thing that was sacrificed during this period. Many international students and temporary workers were taken advantage of and sold a false bill of goods by colleges and crooked immigration consultants. While the programs make no claim of guaranteeing permanent resident status, well, there were implied promises that were made. People were told that by paying huge tuition fees to attend a college program, or that by taking a low wage in Canada, it would give them a far higher chance of achieving permanent resident status, a coveted status that allows non-Canadians the right to stay and work in Canada indefinitely. What's worse is that many of these temporary workers chose to participate in fraudulent LMIA, or jobs for cash scams, where they'd pay consultants and business owners under the table to secure these jobs and additional points as a result towards their permanent residence chances. All of this is something that the Canadian regulators should have been all over and should have never allowed to happen. So, via a YouTube video, the government admitted that they made a mistake and talked about changes to their targets for a temporary residence. Not only would they be reducing the targets in the future for permanent residents, but also they would be reducing the total number of temporary residents in the country, a reduction in total population by 445,000 in 2025, and going on and on here, seeing a net reduction in temporary residents. But these targets are just that, targets. Not mandated laws or guaranteed outcomes, but instead promises made by politicians. And new data shows that these targets, well, we're not exactly on track to make them a reality. It turns out that the numbers for the start of 2025 are drastically different from what many people would expect. Let me show you, but first I want to take a second to thank the sponsor of today's video, and for once, that's me. I just launched a new membership platform, kind of like Patreon, but fully built and hosted by me. It's mostly just an extra way that people can support the channel if you like the kinds of videos I make, especially since sometimes I touch on sensitive or controversial topics, and there's no guarantee that those sponsors or even YouTube will always be a reliable option in the long term. As a member, you'll get access to a private group chat that I'm in regularly, monthly group video calls where we can talk about whatever's on your mind, and a private video feed with occasional bonus content, interviews, and behind-the-scenes stuff that doesn't quite fit on the YouTube channel. I plan on adding more members-only features to the site, including ways where you can help me source information and make connections for future videos. And as a member, you can request features and I'll do my best to bake them into the platform. And if you do choose to join now, you can become a founding member and lock in the lowest price. As we add more to the platform, the prices will go up, but founding members get to keep their rate for the long haul. If this is something you're interested in, well, the link is in the description, or you can go to russmatthewsshow.com. I appreciate all of the support. If you're not interested in it, that's totally cool too. You can just keep on tuning into the YouTube videos. I appreciate your support either way. Now, despite the announcement of these temporary population reductions, the public data that I just downloaded from the government's website tells a contrasting story. This data is all publicly available, but I organized it here for the purposes of this video. It shows all of the new permanent permits issued for temporary workers, as well as all of the new study permits that are issued. And then this bottom sort of area shows this combined number of the two categories. When we look at the combined total for the first 3 months of 2025, we find out that 272,000 new permits were issued, both between foreign workers and international students. This is admittedly lower than the first 3 months of 2024, where we saw 351,000 international students and foreign workers. But if we take this first 3 months of 2025 and we extend it out to a full year very crudely by multiplying it by 4, well then we get an estimate of what this number could be at the end of the year, which looks like 1.09 million new permits issued. While this math is approximate, it also is concerning. With this type of continued growth, how will we hit these reduction targets that the government has laid out for the next number of years? They make clear in their target setting that this is talking about net new temporary residents, or in other words, that the total amount of temporary residents will decrease by this 450,000 number, which would mean that even with 1 million new temporary foreign permits issued, well, we'd expect to see a greater amount expiring and those people leaving the country as a result. The government says that just under 200,000 of the current temporary residents will be transitioning to permanent residents each year, so that will help to bring down the number of temporary residents. But with the approximately 1 million new temporary residents being brought in this year, based on the data I just showed you from the first 3 months of 2025, it's hard to imagine we'll see a net decrease of 450,000 this year as the targets project. Any projections of this actually happening would heavily rely on an assumption that those temporary residents whose work or study permits are expiring will voluntarily leave the country. Now, these permits are really only enforced when someone attempts to cross the border or when complaints are made about individuals or businesses. This enforcement is reactive, not proactive. So I'm skeptical that this kind of mass exit of the country is actually happening, especially as we see a rise in asylum claims partially attributed to the expired permit holders seeking to take advantage of the 2-year processing times as people apply for asylum. This is something that even the former immigration minister Mark Miller talked about. And to its credit, this new bill does address this, and it grants new powers for the government to deal with this issue. Most significantly, they say that if you've been in the country over a year, well then you can't claim asylum. You would have claimed asylum when you first entered the country if that was your reason for entering. So this would largely exclude a lot of the temporary workers and international students who came during this extremely large boom of 2022-2023. Now, admittedly, there are some serious privacy and rights concerns about these new powers, and the Strong Borders Act gives the government and the police forces a lot more power than they had before. But setting that aside for a moment, despite these new controls that have been granted to the government over this immigration and asylum system, it all feels kind of performative to me. Because despite talking a tough game on the issue, nobody is addressing the real elephant in the room. You see, birth rates are cratering in Canada and all around the world, especially in advanced economies. But those economies have also seen similar policies enacted and have faced similar cost of living issues that I would point to as a large contributor to fewer children being born per couple. Meanwhile, we have a rapidly aging population where, if it weren't for immigration and temporary resident programs, our population would already be shrinking. But there are some big problems that come from a shrinking population, and nobody wants to talk about it. If we have fewer and fewer working age people, what happens to our economic growth over the long term? Without that growth, how will the government be able to increase tax revenue to cover its increasing debts? And what about pension plans? Pension plans that not only depend on economic growth to increase their investment returns, but also depend on increasing contribution from active workers. Well, we've seen both major political parties in Canada, the Liberals and the Conservatives. They've both made, in my eyes, performative statements about how our immigration policy needs to be reined in and it shouldn't be rapidly expanding. But while they're saying that, we don't hear them giving any answers to the questions I just asked. These major problems that are coming down the pipeline. And I think it's likely because they know the answer wouldn't be so popular, even if that answer is the easy fix. That answer, of course, being a perpetual growth in the rate of population growth, regardless of what that means for the day-to-day lives of average Canadians. And that outcome definitely won't be able to be achieved, at least at this rate, from simply growing the sizes of families of existing Canadians. And hell, within this existing system that we live in, I don't blame politicians for going in this direction. In a world where our systems, both political and financial, are sustained by unending necessity of forever growth of the economy, it's true that losing this growth would be an existential risk. It would be bad for a lot of people. Now, let me be honest with you. This is what has led me and many other people around the world to start thinking about these systems themselves. Are they sustainable, or will they one day inevitably fail? Can we keep kicking the can down the road and never see any downsides? Can growth really continue indefinitely like this? And what are the consequences of sacrificing everything else in order to make sure that this growth continues? And in the meantime, who's this growth and the continuation of the status quo, who is it really serving? It seems to me that average people aren't seeing as much of the benefit of this growth, while the wealthiest individuals and corporations, the wealthiest in the world, well, they benefit from the growth of their asset values, something that most vulnerable people in the world don't have exposure to. This is going on as average people's hopes for the future seem more and more bleak. The reality in my eyes is that while some politicians may claim to want real, meaningful change, well, most of the time they're just talking about minor tweaks, not systemic overhauls. Because, admittedly, overhauls are risky, and pulling one off could mean that things get worse in the short term in hopes that they get better and more sustainable over the long term. But when you have to get voted back in come the next election, you can't really take the risk of heading yourself and your party down that road. Do you get where I'm going with all of this? I'm curious what you think about it. Let me know in the comments. Do you think that politicians are doing a disservice by not talking about the reason that they seem to be going back towards this type of population growth time and time again? It seems like there's not really these honest conversations about the problems that they're actually trying to solve and what alternative solutions could look like to those problems, if there are any. Either way, let me know what you think, and if you're interested, check out the Russ Matthews Show membership. This is something you can check out. The link is in the description for all the benefits I mentioned earlier. I appreciate your support when it comes to that. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helps you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.